Hey guys, it's CS Joseph with csjoseph.life, filming or recording from the San Jose International Airport, and it's because I'm going overseas right now. But just because I'm going overseas, well, that's no excuse for me to not maintain my YouTube channel, right? So, that being said, let's dive into the next episode in our series about virtue and vice. So we've been talking about the ESTJ, the ESTP, and the ENTJ, and for right now we're going to be focusing on the ENFJ, also known as the mentor. So, the mentor is very interesting as it is one of the direct initiating control types, but it's also an idealist. Yesterday's type, the chief, ENTJ, that's an intellectual. But as of today, focusing on more of an idealistic type within its temperament. So, ENFJ. ENFJ is got a very interesting virtue and vice, especially because it's very polarizing. And compared to the ENTJ, where it's more altruistic versus avarice, this one is kind of more personal and more people focused, obviously because they're an idealist. So anyway, the virtue and vice of the ENFJ is known as benevolence versus cruelty. So the ENFJ can be the most benevolent of all the types. Benevolence means that they're so giving, that they're all about other people and how they feel, and they want to give that really good experience, that FE, hero, SE child point of view, right? Because they're also trying to teach people things and show people things, but they're doing it out of the kindness of their heart, right? Super, super benevolent. You can always call an ENFJ and they will help you. They will offer help. They will do their best to make your life better in some capacity. They take it very seriously. And because they take it so seriously, they do it from an in-charge standpoint. It's almost like they're a walking institution for good, or a walking activism executor, or a walking charity to some point. Although they're not the most charitable of all the types, that's actually a different type, but ENFJ benevolence can lead them to taking on a charity and supporting that charity and supporting activism in that way, shape, or form. That's actually very normal for them. Now, because they get so benevolent and they're helping other people, they're being really good, well, that usually, it's similar to how, ENTJs get, where, there could be strings attached depending on who initiates the request. If someone's asking the ENFJ for help, there's a risk of strings being attached instead of the ENFJ just straight up offering to help, which is what they usually do anyway, through their benevolence. But in the situation where there's strings attached, you have to be careful. So why is that? Well, because they can be really cruel about it. They walk around, if they believe that they're so giving, right? They're so giving to others, that they give others such a good experience, that they want those people around them that receive these gifts from them, because they love giving gifts. They very much love giving gifts. Receiving gifts is cool, but giving gifts is a big deal. But if that doesn't cause a person to become loyal to them, or makes that person disloyal, then they get really butthurt about it, and then they can get really cruel. And the ENFJ can actually be the cruelest of all the types. I remember my father. He's actually an ENFJ, and I gotta say, he is one of the most cruel people I have ever met. In as much as he is one of the most giving people I have ever met. He is so giving that he gave a good portion of his life away to his belief system, to his spirituality, to his church, very much, because he always was involved in church leadership. always wanted to help people, very focused on how people feel, trying to give them the best experience possible. And he literally would walk around wanting to do this and be as benevolent as possible. Everyone knew that they could call on my father and ask him for help, and he would help them. Even bring those people into his home, especially disaffected youth. I remember growing up as a child, and there was tons of disaffected youth in my home on a regular basis, right? So he's an ENFJ. But the thing is, though, he just all of a sudden turned super cruel. I remember this one memory I had when I was little, and I saw this peacock in the back of the yard. It was gigantic. It's the first time I ever seen a peacock before. I never even knew what they looked like. To me, it just looked like some crazy wild turkey, right? So my dad, because he's an ENFJ, likes to host social events at our home, and he was doing that usually with members of the church or whatnot. And this turkey was in the backyard, and I saw it, And then, I'm just a kid, right? So I go out to where everyone's sitting around the fire in the front yard, and I go tell him, hey, there's this giant bird turkey thing in the backyard. And he's like, okay, well, let's go take a look. So he gets up, and everyone follows him, right? And so they all follow me back to the backyard, or follow him, actually, because, ENFJs are in charge, right? They're structure types, direct initiating control, so they usually take lead, right? So he was leading, and they led us all to the backyard, and and then we saw the bird, and then he says to me, hey, what do you see? Like, I looked at him like, what do you mean? He's like, what do you see? And then I said, Dad, there's a turkey in the backyard. And he points his finger right at me in front of everybody and says, yes, there is, right? It was very embarrassing. It was very cruel, especially, for an SI inferior ENTP child. Some of you watching this would be like, wow, that's actually pretty funny. And it is. Let's be honest, it actually is funny. And some of you watching, it's like, oh, wow, that could be, like, pretty cruel, especially, like, come on. Like, I was the fat kid in school, for example, I weighed 287 pounds when I was 14 years old, okay? That was the highest I ever weighed in my life, and I was 14 years old. I was going into high school when I was that big. I hated it. So being the fat kid in school and being, made me super sensitive to those situations, right? Which only made the cruelty even further. I also remember another time with my dad, he'd talk about, grades were very important to him, right? And he would threaten me about having anything lower than a B- in my grades at school. It was terrifying, and he was extremely cruel about it. I would say, very heavy-handed, right, with what he would threaten me. Like, okay, well, if you don't have good grades, you're grounded for, like, the next 9 weeks, and all you do is, in your room, you could sit in your room and sit on a box, and that's how you're going to spend all your time, basically. Like, he'd threaten me with those things on a regular basis. And it just goes beyond that too. I mean, I've also been in relationships with ENFJs, romantic relationships. I'm actually in a romantic relationship with one right now, and she can also get really cruel sometimes. Especially if you think about it, ENFJ-ENTP relationship, the ENFJ oftentimes accuses the ENTP of being super cruel. The reason why is because the ENTP, well, it's just being sincere, right? But the problem is that when you're being sincere and telling nothing but the truth hurts people, right? They have negative emotional reactions to hearing truth, right? Which ends up pissing off the ENFJ, and they're no longer interested in being benevolent anymore. And instead of that, they just go super cruel mode. And, they could say the most terrible things, the most disrespectful things you've ever heard. And it's like, wow, where did that come from? It's just they get so caught up in the moment, and they get so enraged in the moment that it can actually cause a lot I know, it's kind of like they're going Super Saiyan almost, you know what I mean? They got the bright yellow hair, the golden aura, the menacing green eyes, you know, these ENFJs when they're in rage mode, when they're upset, and they could say some of those cruel things you ever heard. INFJs could do this too, definitely, don't worry, but it is not as bad as ENFJs. ENFJs, it can get even worse, you know, and even to the point where they'd almost be willing to strike you in some cases, although I've never actually dealt with that, at least in my romantic relationships. But I have dealt with that with my father. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my father and I respect him, and he's a great guy, and a good man, and many would definitely say that. But it just goes to show you that even ENFJs are human. Even ENFJs struggle with a vice, right? And the vice is cruelty. They love jokes, and sometimes their jokes are so true and so, like, they cut people down. You know, ENFJs, they have this thing where, like, oh, I'm building you up, and then all of a sudden they just cut you to shreds and there's nothing left, right? Oh, and then it's like, well, I had to break you down in order to build you up, type of a thing. That's a very ENFJ point of view. ISTPs, because they have ENFJ subconscious, they actually do this similarly as well, except they kind of do it from the point of view, well, I'm just going to break you down the majority of the time and only lift you up if you need it, if you're not able to lift yourself up, right? But again, an ISTP, although people accuse them of being super cruel, not as cruel as the ENFJ, because the ENFJ, because they're Fe hero, that really knows where to attack somebody. Because the best way to win a war or a battle with your adversary is you attack their heart. And that's what ENFJs are all about with their vice. Cruelty. They can be the most cruel people you have ever met. So what you got to do is try to keep them focused on being benevolent as much as possible. It's very important, especially when you're in a relationship with one or being raised with one. You keep them benevolent. And you do that by giving them recognition, by giving them their day in court. You always want to listen to them, because an ENFJ that's not listened to, they will go cruel immediately. You got to be very careful. If you have a pattern of behavior where you are not listening to their TI inferior, good luck, because then their demon is going to come out, and their demon is super cruel. It is this ESTJ taskmaster that's got a whip, and it will whip you and whip you and whip you, because the beatings will continue until morale improves. That is literally the vice of the ENFJ, cruelty. Be careful. Keep them a benevolent mode. Give them their day in court. Always show them appreciation and recognition for all of their contributions to you. Give them the freedom to do whatever they want, and to be able to give people a good experience, and allow them to take charge and allow them to take the lead. It is absolutely important that you do this, because at times, especially if they get upset and angry, and then the extroverted sensing rage activates in conjunction with their TE demon, and that's what we call the demonic child. When that demonic child comes out, oh man, that cruelty, they will hit you where it hurts, where you least expect it. And they will not only do it privately, but they will do it in public as well, which will lead to people which would potentially lead to your reputation being destroyed in front of others, as well as them losing respect amongst their peers if they're doing it in front of their peers, because their peers would be like, wow, that ENFJ guy or gal is taking it way too far. So you gotta be super, super careful in those situations. Also, now, the vice of cruelty, it doesn't necessarily mean it's always a bad thing. It can be a bad thing, and people's vices obviously can be bad things, but sometimes it can be a good thing to a point. Sometimes cruelty is necessary in order to get somebody to learn a lesson that they are not willing to learn, right? Because if you could put this like shock on them, you know, a kind of a shock and awe point of view, because that's literally what ENFJs are all about. They're all about shock and awe. If you do a shock and awe situation with ENFJs, then you find yourself in a position where that person is learning. You know, they're actually willing to learn, because it destroys pride, right? So that cruelty can be used to destroy unnecessary pride and get someone thinking in the right, behaving morally for once, or making better decisions and being more responsible. And that's how ENFJs can responsibly use that vice to really help someone. But I'm sorry, the majority of the time, they take it way too far, their cruelty, and it is extremely punishing and overbearing. In the same way that they can be overbearing with their benevolence and helping people and healing people and building people up, they can be very overbearing with their cruelty. So just realize it's important to stay balanced. Stay balanced between your virtue and vice. And, if you're in a relationship with an ENFJ, make sure you give them the recognition, you give them their day in court, you give them the freedom that they need, and everything will be fine. And then realize that when they're getting ragey and they're angry at you and they're saying super cruel things, they mean it in the moment, but they do not mean it long term. It's not something that you have to take and just realize it's like, this is how they feel about me all the time. It's not that at all. That's not what their ego is saying. Remember, it's the demonic child, right? Don't listen to the demonic child and its stupid accusations about you and how disloyal you might be or whatever. Because again, also, ENFJs, when they're being cruel, a lot of the times they're jumping to conclusions because they're an NJ type, right? NJs have this problem where all NJs jump to conclusions about what other people are doing, and then they accuse and pass judgment on those people without giving those people an opportunity to change or defend themselves. For example, my dad, there's this drug addict that used to go to church with, and I met this guy, years later after being a small child in my young adulthood, and I told my dad about it, and my dad's like, that guy, he's a drug addict. And I'm like, Dad, he's been clean for 15 years. He's actually a really cool dude, and he wants to talk to you. My dad wouldn't have anything to do with him, right? It's because NJs, all NJs have this thing where, when someone wrongs them or they observe wrong, that is frozen in time, basically, in their psyche, and that person is that way forever until proven and observed by them otherwise. The thing is, though, the NJ has no desire to observe that person because the NJ has already made that decision about that person. And that's even worse with the ENFJs because of their cruelty factor with their vice, and it's like, what the hell? So what I end up having to do with like my dad or my girlfriend, etc., I end up having to kind of force them to recognize that people have changed, and I have to remind both of them. My aunt is also an ENFJ. I have to remind all of them that give people room to the room to change because they need to change without being aware that someone might be a better person because they've changed, they've matured in their life. They're losing out on excellent opportunities to have relationships with people, and they're choosing to close themselves off. INFJs do that too, but not as bad as the ENFJ, and again, NJs in general kind of all have this problem, but NTJs are willing to... It's funny, NTJs get a lot of crap about, being unloving and whatnot, but in reality, NTJs can be really, really forgiving, more so than NFJs, believe it or not. So it's just a little bit of a segue to kind of bring more perspective to this particular virtue and vice. So anyway, if you found this lecture helpful, insightful, please subscribe to the channel or to the podcast. If you have any questions about ENFJs or their virtue and vice, please leave it in the comments section, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you may have regarding that. So anyway, I'm going to be on the plane for like the longest time and going overseas, and we'll be shooting videos consistently and recording consistently. Hopefully I'm able to upload them. We'll find out. But yeah, I'll see you guys tonight.